You captured Long Beach's imagination as you put your plan in place. You brought us top-notch experts from NOAA and the like to bring us facts and research, to teach us how to fight. On every wall and window, on ceiling, tank, and stair, each visitor saw the wonders that the Pacific had to share. The puffins, seals, and otters, the jelly, sharks, and crabs, octopi, rays, and penguins, and fish, both colorful and drab. And every mom and teacher and every kid and dad saw the beauties of the ocean and left Long Beach feeling glad. They came and learned the stories of the oceans full of fish, that sea creatures are wondrous, and that man puts all that at risk. You achieved almost all the plans that you could see, with the exception of eliminating the Long Beach Grand Prix. From opera to aquaculture to science on a sphere, from Pacific Vision's galleries to the lectures we hold dear. If you're a volunteer or camper or visitor or staff or a friend like me, all the treasures all the good times and the chats, the joy and awe and relevancy you brought to the AOP will make us all all ocean stewards that you challenged us to be. And so, Jerry, if you would come up here, we are using this occasion. Jerry thought we just were going to give him a chance to speak, but actually the only reason why we did that was because we are making him tonight the emeritus president of the Aquarium, and we're going to present him with this plaque.
Thank you, Doug.
Margaret assures me we're... We'll just hold on to you.
Okay.
So Jerry's done so much for us, and it's a treat to have him back here to give his first talk about his new book. And so congratulations, Jerry, and I'm going to have Peter come back up and do the actual introduction.
Stay there, Jerry.
Yeah. I want to say thank you, because this really means a lot to us. You guys brought Margaret and me here 18 years ago. For nearly 2 decades, we worked for an institution we love, with people we love, in a city we love, and it was a fantastic time. I wouldn't trade it for anything. And I'm a little bit disappointed that it took the pandemic to do something that I couldn't do in 18 years, and that is to get rid of the Grand Prix, even for only a year.
So he might have written that book in only 1 year, but I don't want to give a traditional academic sort of pedigree, but Jerry did his Ph.D. at Johns Hopkins, so he spent 50 years since his Ph.D. getting this book done. So it's not quite as fast as made it sound, but and he's been working. He's been an expert on the Chesapeake for half a century, and I'm not sure how well it's doing. We'll hear today. Been an academic leader. A dean of marine science at Stony Brook, a provost at Stony Brook, and I think, did you bring Akira Okubo to Stony Brook? Yeah. So somebody was on my PhD committee, and one of the most brilliant oceanographers there ever was, Jerry recruited to the U.S. and to Stony Brook, and I thank you personally for that. The only other thing I'd say is these first Wednesdays are supposed to be about thought leadership. Jerry is the quintessential thought leader. Thought leadership is... it's not, you think scientists, it's not analyzing data. It's not just doing an experiment. Thought leader is changing the questions we ask, reframing everything, saying, hey, we're asking the wrong questions. We need to be looking at it this way. And that's what Jerry's done for his whole career. And I think you'll see that when he talks about a book. I don't want to steal his thunder, but he certainly did it here at the Aquarium. He said, let's reimagine what an aquarium is. And I can't imagine a better thought leader to help us launch this first Wednesday. Thank you, Jerry, and I'm looking forward to asking you questions afterward.
Peter, thank you. Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here and to see so many old friends and new friends in the audience. So I want to talk to you about the Chesapeake, shaping the future. And as Peter said, I studied the Chesapeake Bay for a long time. And some of you may be wondering why you in California should be interested in the Chesapeake Bay. It's 3,000 miles away on the East Coast. And we don't have any true estuaries in Southern California. We have San Francisco Bay in Northern California. But in many ways, the Chesapeake Bay is the nation's estuary. When Jamestown was established on the James River, it became the first permanent English colony in what would become the United States. It's the largest estuary in the United States, the second largest in the world, second only to the St. Lawrence in Canada. And the bay often is referred to as the mother of all estuaries. And John Smith said there is but one entrance by sea into this country, and that is at the mouth of a very goodly bay, 18 to 20 miles broad. So what is an estuary? An estuary is a semi-enclosed coastal body of water freely connected to the ocean, within which seawater is mixed with and measurably diluted by fresh water from runoff. And the Chesapeake Bay has all those features in spades. And when I said there are no true estuaries in Southern California, it's because we don't have any rivers in Southern California that flow year-round. In fact, except during the rainy season, the largest source of fresh water to our coastal areas are the sewage treatment plants that line our coastline. So this definition came from Donald W. Pritchard. He was the founding director of the Chesapeake Bay Institute. He was the founding chairman of the Department of Oceanography at Johns Hopkins. He was my major professor, and we remained friends and colleagues right up until the time that he died. So for decades, the Chesapeake Bay provided the model for estuarine research and management. It set the bar. There were a series of institutions around the bay that focused almost exclusively on the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay Institute, which I was part of, was one of those. The Chesapeake Biological Laboratory, the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences. That model worked for a long time. It worked right up until maybe 100 years ago when climate started to change and these coastal environments began to change. Buckminster Fuller once said, to change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. That's what I see as the challenge for Chesapeake Bay, because all estuaries around the world are roughly the same age, 10,000 years old, and they all are being changed rapidly, and we need a new model for estuarine research and for management. But before we look at that, let's look quickly at the past Chesapeake, the present Chesapeake, and the future. When and how was the Chesapeake Bay formed? Well, it was formed by the most recent rise in sea level that began about 20,000 years ago. 20,000 years ago, the Ice Age ended. Sea level began to rise rapidly. So you see on the axis on the bottom, these are thousands of years before the present. The present is 0, and this is sea level change in hundreds of feet below present sea level. So sea level rose rapidly up until about 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, slowed dramatically, and remained relatively constant up until about 150 years ago. And it was during that time of stable sea level that most coastal development around the country and around the world took place, because everybody expected this was going to continue. This was a figure shows the maximum extent of the glaciers 20,000 years ago, and about as the glaciers began to melt and retreat 18 to 20,000 years ago, the meltwater was returned to the ocean began to rise and advance. If you look at this physiographic diagram that was created back in the 50s by Bruce Hazen and Marie Tharp at Lamont Geological Observatory, it shows the North Atlantic, the mid-oceanic ridge. Do I have a pointer? I do. Okay, this is the mid-oceanic ridge, mid-Atlantic ridge. This whole area along the East Coast, this flat area, and you can see Chesapeake Bay is right there. That area, 20,000 years ago, was high and dry and exposed to the atmosphere. It was high and dry for long enough to be populated by northern boreal forests and to be home for animals like this. Large mastodons, tapir, horses. North American was also probably first visited by Native Americans about 14,000 years ago. And in all likelihood, they lived for part of that time on the continental shelf, close to the Susquehanna River that flowed across the shelf. They would have camped, and they would have probably moved with the rising sea across the shelf as it moved to the present mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. Now, you may be asking, have we ever had a sea level rise higher than today? In the interglacial before the one that we're in now, the Eemian, which was 130,000 years ago, sea level was 20 to 30 feet higher than today. The average temperature of the Earth was 5 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than today, but the level of atmospheric CO2 was only about 280 parts per million compared to today's 420. And if you go back even further, to the last time the Earth was ice-free, that would be in the Pliocene, 3 to 3.5 million years ago, and in the Pliocene, sea level was 50 to 80 feet higher than today. CO2 levels were twice or 2.5 times higher than today. But it's interesting, if you look at the current rise in the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, if the current trend continues, atmospheric CO2 will double by the end of this century. So it all happened before, and this should raise the alarm for all of us. You can see the blue line. That's the maximum extent of the glaciers. This is what the shoreline was like 20,000 years ago when sea level was 400 feet lower. In the Pliocene, this is what the shoreline looked like. You can see that much of Florida is gone, much of the Gulf Coast is underwater. Miami is long gone. And it did happen before. And if you look at, this is a graph along the bottom, we have the present going back 500,000 years. This is the global mean temperature, and you can see that every time we had a temperature, a mean temperature of about 12 C, sea level was high. Today, 130,000 years ago, the Eemian, and during those periods, we had a Chesapeake Bay. But they were separated by glacial periods that were much longer. So the Chesapeake Bay came and went with rises and falls of sea level, and for the last 500,000 years, and even for the entire Pleistocene, which lasted about 2.6 million years, most of the time we didn't have a Chesapeake Bay. So what's causing the current rise in sea level? It's caused by the warming of the Earth, which is driven by the burning of fossil fuels primarily, secondarily by land use practices, and a tertiary cause is the manufacturing of cement. And this is the famous Keeling curve. Started back in 1958 by Charles David Keeling, and it continued up until 2005 when he died. His son Ralph took it over, and it continues to this day. And the CO2 is measured every single day on a mountain, on Mauna Loa, and you can see that from 1958 The concentration was about 313 parts per million, and today it's over 420, and it continues to go up. So this is what's causing the sea level rise, this famous familiar curve over here, because you can see this sea level is going up again, and how far up is uncertain, and much of it has to do with what we humans choose to do. In addition to global sea level rise, there are local effects. The land can go up, it can go down, you can remove water from aquifers and other factors. So we have an effect, a local and regional effect. And when the sea level rise of the lower Chesapeake Bay will be something like twice the global average. We're pumping groundwater out of the land in the lower part of the bay, but more importantly, remember when we had that massive ice in the north of Chesapeake Bay? That was pushing down on the crust. The crust was sinking, and the farther south, when you push it down here, it goes up here. When the ice retreats, this rebounds now, and the lower bay is going down. So imagine Chesapeake Bay with a rise of sea level twice the global average. What's it going to do? Well, it's going to erode all the islands. It's going to drown the bay's wetlands. It's going to drown low-lying communities around the bay. It'll increase the tidal range and tidal mixing. It will increase the vulnerability of the whole region to coastal storms because you're putting hurricanes, nor'easters, and other storms on top of a higher sea. And it will alter the ongoing battle that always exists in estuaries between rivers and tides for dominion over the circulation. Now, let's look at the watershed, because the watershed is key to the story of the Chesapeake Bay. When John Smith arrived, the watershed was almost entirely covered by forests. Small areas had been cleared by Native Americans for agriculture, but by and large, it was 100% forested or 95%. Colonists began to clear by 1750, maybe it was down to 90%. Early colonists did a lot of agriculture, and by 1880, it had dropped to about 40%. And then in the last few decades, the amount of forested cover has been recovering. So we have more forests today than we had, say, 150 years ago. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation and the Chesapeake Bay Program estimates that we still lose 100 acres of forest every single day. And many of the forests that remain are fragmented by roads, by railroads, by shopping centers, power lines, etc. So the other part of an estuary, remember, the rivers. These are the rivers of Chesapeake Bay, more than 50 tributary rivers. But there are only 3 that account for 80% of all the freshwater input. We have the Potomac that goes up to Washington, D.C., the James down here, where John Smith established Jamestown, and it doesn't show very well here, but the Susquehanna. And if you look at the figure behind me, the smaller map, the reason the Susquehanna is so dominant is it has such a large drainage basin. These 3 rivers account for more than 80% of the total freshwater input to the system, and the Susquehanna accounts for more than 50%. And the Susquehanna is the largest river flowing into the Atlantic Ocean from the United States. Now, this is a cartoon of early colonists growing tobacco. That was their primary product. The rivers gave access to the interior to the colonists. They could move upstream, they could establish farms, and they also provided arteries for them to move their products back downstream for shipment back to England. But they also brought with them the byproducts of human activities. Sediment, particularly. Tobacco is very hard on the land. and the soil wears out in just a few years. Since there was lots of land available and accessible, they would simply abandon their tobacco fields and go on, move to new ones, and left them high and dry, subject to erosion, and we had large inputs of sediment into Chesapeake Bay. The deterioration of the bay, when it began, was first revealed by scientists from the University of Alabama. They analyzed oyster shells. Oysters make a living by filtering their food out, and when they're filtering it out, they're also filtering other things out, and they laid down deposits in the shells of oysters. And they were able to document that by the mid-1800s, the Chesapeake Bay was already suffering significant decline. But it wasn't until an act of Congress, decades later, that we had a comprehensive study of Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay Program was created by an act of Congress when the newly formed United States Environmental Protection Agency was directed to conduct a comprehensive study. That was 1977. Every congressionally mandated study to this day requires a champion. The champion for Chesapeake Bay was Senator Charles Mack Mathias from Maryland. He secured $27 million for a study of Chesapeake Bay by the EPA. It was the first congressionally mandated study of any estuary in the United States. It produced a report called A Framework for Action in 1983, and it led to the creation of the Chesapeake Bay Program. This is the cover of that report. It identified the major problem being eutrophication, over-fertilization by nutrients. And the solution was to reduce the nutrient inputs to restore the bay to what was called a saved bay. A saved bay was defined by the Governor's Conference in 1983 as one resilient enough to withstand the storms of nature and of humankind, and is rich enough to nurture diverse cultures and contribute abundantly to our economy. They rated it a 70 on the State of the Bay Index. The condition of the bay when John Smith sailed in 1607 was given 100. So Saved Bay was considerably less. And they have given now, for the last 15 or 20 years, letter grades to the environmental health of the bay. They defined a C as a grade of 40. Now talk about grade inflation. When I went to school, a 40 would have been an F. A 70 would have been a C. 70 in this case was a saved bay. This is what the Health of the Bay Index looked like. Here you can see back 1985 all the way to 2020, and these are the Chesapeake Bay overall grades and percentages. You can see it hovers around a C. In fact, it's never been higher than a C+. This trend line that the program drew in, they were quite excited about the trend line, and they reported that the trend line was encouraging. I don't know how you get encouraged about a trend line like that. And if you extrapolate that trend line, it would take to the end of the century to achieve a saved bay. But it's going to be increasingly difficult to keep that trend in the face of climate change and all of the associated things with climate change. So, why so little progress? Was it the lack of scientific expertise around the Chesapeake Bay? Was it the lack of money? Just $24 billion has been spent already, probably about $25 billion. Was it any or all of these combined? No, it had nothing to do with this. There's more scientific expertise around Chesapeake Bay than any estuary in the United States, probably in the world. It was none of these, so why? The watershed dominates the system. Chesapeake Bay has the largest watershed of any estuary in the United States and the largest of any estuary in the world. And if you look at the ratio of the area of the watershed to the area or the volume of the bay, that ratio is the largest of any estuary in the world. So you take all of the materials generated by a population of 18 million and growing that are within that watershed and consider how they get washed downstream and focused in the Chesapeake Bay. It's no wonder that the system has been so difficult to restore. There's another factor, and that's the governance. This is the map of the drainage basin. You can see there are 6 states and the District of Columbia that make this up. And while there always are strong agreements to meet certain water quality standards or total maximum daily loads, when push comes to shove, all of those are voluntary commitments, and it's not infrequent that something causes them to be displaced. So how will climate change make it even more challenging to maintain this trend? We will have a warmer bay. Warmer waters hold less dissolved oxygen. Sea level rises and tidal mixing will increase. Precipitation will increase in the watershed. River flow becomes more variable, more flashy, and the ocean and the bay become more acidic, which make it more difficult for shellfish. And if you look at the warming of the bay, since 1980, the temperature has increased in 92% of the system at a rate of 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. And the projected increase is that the average bay temperature will go up 4 to 10 degrees F by 2100. There's a very interesting urbanization effect. Streams have gone up by 2.5 degrees since 1960, according to the U.S. Geological Survey. Any of you who walk around a city in a hot summer day, you know how hot the pavement, dark surfaces, sidewalks can get, or even the tops of buildings, and that water then runs into the bay, and that is making a significant contribution to the warming of Chesapeake Bay. So again, the dissolved oxygen goes down, the summer anoxia, hypoxia will increase, making a bad situation worse. We've had low oxygen zones in Chesapeake Bay ever since the first studies by the Chesapeake Bay Institute in the late 1940s. But in all likelihood, they go back to even before, to colonial times, simply because of the circulation of the bay. The bay's biological community is changing with a warming bay. Many animals that can move are moving. Many of those that cannot are at risk. And because many of the animals that live in Chesapeake Bay are near their southern limits of temperature tolerance. So as the temperature goes up, they're going to exit the bay and move farther north. And they will be replaced by animals from farther south. This is what the dead zone looked like in 2005. Every place that's red or orange, these are low oxygen. And it's fairly extensive. Now, the recent reports are that the dead zone this summer will be smaller than normal. That encourages some people, but it shouldn't. The reason, if you look, the river flow over the last 12 months in the entire watershed has been way down, and the amount of river flow and the stratification are major factors in this. This is the bay's iconic striped bass. It's living near its southern limit, and in all likelihood, it will leave the bay. Other fish, as I mentioned, will move from farther north, from farther south into the bay, and they include shrimp, mullet, Spanish mackerel, but the populations of organisms in the bay will change. It will be quite a different bay. What about our beloved Atlantic oyster, Crassostrea virginica? They can't move, and they get a double whammy. They're near their upper limit of temperature, and with ocean acidification, it gets more difficult for them to make their shells. It gets even worse, because as sea level rises, the salinity of the bay increases, because more seawater comes in. And so predators like sea stars will come in and take a toll on some of the oysters. The bay's seagrass meadows once covered much of the Chesapeake Bay, but they're going to decline. They already have declined significantly, and they will go down even more. And they're an important part of the bay's ecosystem, particularly for the famous Chesapeake Bay blue crab. When the blue crab molts, it's very vulnerable to predators, and they like to go into these seagrass meadows and hide. So in the midst of all of this that's happening, you have the continuing struggle between the rivers and the tides for domination of the bay's circulation. Now, this is part of the audience participation part of this program. So if you had no river flow and no tide, what would happen? Somebody. It would fill up with seawater, and it would go as up to when sea level would intersect with the floor of the rivers, and it would stop. Now, if we add river flow, what happens? The river flows out on top. It has to get through the estuary to the ocean. It mixes a little bit with the underlying seawater. There are what are called Helmholtz instability waves that develop along the upper part of the salt water. And so you get some mixing, but not a whole lot. Now with the tide, what happens? You now start to slosh this mass of water back and forth, and you increase the mixing of the salt water and the fresh water, and it really changes things. So how does the relative strength of river flow versus tidal flow affect the circulation? Well, if you look at, this is a schematic diagram of a typical estuarine circulation, where you take a section down the axis of an estuary from the ocean to the river, and you can see the seawater moving up in the lower layer, the river water moving toward the ocean in the upper layer. And if you look at what this would look like for Chesapeake Bay, the lines that are here are what are called isohalines, lines of constant salinity. And you can see Chesapeake Bay has the same general pattern as the classical partially mixed estuary in the top. And so we have 3 parts per million, all the way down here to 24, 25. If I show you Delaware Bay, what's different? What do you think in Delaware Bay? Is the tide more or less important in Delaware Bay than in Chesapeake Bay? Much more important, because look, the isohalines are now almost vertical, so the water at any given point in the estuary is essentially constant salinity top to bottom. It increases, its salinity increases along the axis the closer you get to the ocean, but it certainly, this is looking down the axis of Chesapeake Bay from the river to the ocean. So you can see the salt water coming in, the fresh water mixed with salt water going out, and the boundary between these is tilted. It's because of the Earth's rotation. We're in the northern hemisphere, and the Coriolis effect causes that to happen. And this is another schematic showing that if the dots represent salt particles, and the interesting thing is in a partially mixed estuary, if you have sediment being introduced by the river, and many of these fine particles, they are the vehicles that carry the contaminants with them. So if you have fine particles coming down, they settle eventually into the lower layer, and the estuarine circulation brings them back upstream, and they accumulate in what's this area that's called a null zone. So the upper reaches of most estuaries, partially mixed estuaries at least, have higher concentrations of contaminants. So what about the rainfall? Well, we've seen an increase in the intensity of rainfall since 1958, and we are predicting that there will be a significant increase both in the total rainfall and in the intensity of rainfall events in the watershed of Chesapeake Bay. So that's not good news for the Chesapeake Bay. Climate change and sea level rise, as I mentioned, the effects of hurricanes, nor'easters, and other coastal storms will increase. Coastal flooding will become much more important. Many low-lying areas that are around the bay that many of us grew to love will be underwater, and retreat from the shoreline becomes a very important factor. So to summarize some of this, strong headwinds will make it even more difficult to stay even on that very unimpressive trend line. Sea level rise, the warming of the bay, increasing acidification, changing precipitation and runoff patterns, and I think we are underestimating the financial challenges that are caused by the post-COVID-19 wake. We're going to have to be focusing more on restoring people's lives and livelihoods than on restoring an estuary, particularly when we've been so unsuccessful at doing it. Will Rogers has some good advice when you find yourself in a situation like this. He said, if you find yourself in a hole, the first thing to do is to stop digging. We didn't do that in Chesapeake Bay. We asked for bigger shovels and more money. Maybe, just maybe, restoration isn't the best strategy. Restoration means to restore to an earlier time or condition. Winston Churchill, in his famous Finest Hour speech in June of 1940, said, if we open a quarrel between the past and the present, we shall find that we have lost the future. Restoration opens a quarrel between the past and the present. And I'm concerned that unless we change this, we will have lost the bay's future. We are confronted with this whole series of new problems called wicked problems. If you pull on any one of these, this giant massive ball starts to come unraveled. Some of the characteristics of wicked problems are that they evade clear definition. They're multi-causal with many interdependencies. They often are not stable. There's no single solution. They're socially complex, and every wicked problem is unique. So the same strategies that would work in Chesapeake Bay wouldn't work in San Francisco Bay. And most of us were never trained or educated to deal with wicked problems. That's not what you get rewarded to do in academia. Academia is a field of brickmakers, scholars dedicated to producing discrete pieces of knowledge. Andrew Hoffman wrote in the Chronicle of Higher Education in 2015 an article about this, and he referred to an earlier article by Bernard Forscher in Science that most scholars are brickmakers. And the challenge is whether we can assemble and fuse these pieces of bricks, these various bricks, because we have more knowledge about Chesapeake Bay than any estuary in the world. I'm confident of that. Can we infuse them together to help shape its future? Not just to add to what we know about the bay, but can we shape its future? Those were the ideas really that stimulated me to undertake this book. The Chesapeake Bay has more bricks than any other estuary, and the best strategy that I know of for dealing with an uncertain future is what's called scenario planning. Not the kind of scenario planning we talk about where we're going to do a high COVID-19 scenario and a low COVID-19 scenario, but the kind that was developed in the 1940s by the Rand Corporation and later perfected by Shell Development. It's rarely used in the environmental field. And if it is, it's only used at the global scale or the local scale, but very rarely at the regional scale where most environmental problems now need to be tackled. Each scenario is an internally consistent, plausible pathway to the future. It's not a prediction, it's a plausible pathway to the future. And the idea is that you map out a small number of these, 3 to 5, that bound the range of probable futures. To do it, you have to form teams with diverse perspectives. You need to have scientists, including social scientists, engineers, designers, some wild cards, planners, humanists, environmentalists, storytellers, artists, stakeholders. And you form teams by lottery, making sure that each team has all the required diversity of skill sets. Each team has the same inputs, and each team has a distinctive title. And the title guides each team's exploration, the path that it takes. But each one, no matter which path it takes, is to achieve a vision. So if you look at scenario planning, it all starts with a vision. Not the kind that many engineers write of water quality standards or total maximum daily loads, but a compelling essay, the kind that Wendell Berry might write, that excites you. And the inputs are driving forces. Climate change is certainly one. Predetermined elements, these are things that have already happened or are in the pipeline. And critical uncertainties. Critical uncertainties are largely human decisions. They depend upon priorities. Although sea level rise, while it's a predetermined element, the amount sea level will rise is uncertain. So that could fall into 2 categories. You play these against each other. Each of these teams does. And the outputs then is a series of internally consistent and plausible pathways to the future. I've done enough of these now to know how they can work. They always produce surprises. They build a strong community. We've done them in Long Island Sound. We did them on the south shore of Long Island. We did one on the Delmarva Peninsula, which is the peninsula that separates Chesapeake Bay and Delaware Bay. We did it in the salt ponds of South San Francisco Bay. There were 4 of us that were the scientific advisors on draining those salt ponds and turning them into wetlands. We did some of this, and we wrote a report that in the face of a rising sea, it was not a good choice. The state of California decided to fire all of us, but I think we gave them good advice. The hardest scenario planning I ever did was leading the strategic planning for Ben Gurion University in Jerusalem, in Israel, not in Jerusalem, in Beersheba. Ben Gurion's dream was that the future of Israel lay in the desert, and he wanted to build a great university like Jerusalem and Haifa. But there wasn't enough money, and the question became, how can you build a great university with international stature? It has to be a different kind of university, and that was the challenge. Going there as a Presbyterian from New York made it a far more difficult challenge than it might have been. But they discovered some of the ideas, and they have followed those, and it's been very important. So scenarios are also what are referred to as wind tunnels for testing your ideas. I think if you tested some of the ideas of the Chesapeake Bay Program using scenario planning, they would be blown away in a wind tunnel. So let me give you some takeaways. I think, first of all, restoration should be reserved for old cars, old paintings, old houses, and old furniture. Climate change demands that we reframe our relationship with the ocean and start at the coast. Coasts are at the leading edge of change. Restoration of rapidly changing coastal environments, it simply won't work. A better strategy is to focus on their future. Rigorous scenario planning is a powerful and underused strategy for dealing with an uncertain future. And Chesapeake Bay would be a good place for the development of a new model because we have so much knowledge and so much experience there. So I thank you, and I will be happy to take some questions. Before we do that, I want to thank Margaret and Kathy for the help with the slides. But who has a question? Larry. Larry, you know the rule. You don't get to ask a question unless you buy a book.
I'm figuring 3 questions.
Oh, 3. All right, go ahead.
So, is it on? Yes. So early on, you were saying the acidification, and I've never heard anybody talk about the acidification of the water that happens in a watershed as opposed to the acidification that happens in the ocean. And that interests me. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, the ocean is getting more acidic, but the seawater has more buffering capacity than fresh water. So it's really the exchange with the atmosphere and the CO2 that's being added. So estuaries are going to have a more serious problem than the open ocean. Val?
I'm wondering about what has happened in Washington State lately, and if it can be compared to the Chesapeake Bay. The water temperature has risen so high, and the temperature of the land also so high, that the clams are dying. They're found dead on the beach. Is this a similar thing that is happening?
Yeah, although the answer is yes, and those are probably clams who are living close to shore where the temperature would go up even more. And we see losses of shellfish in the Chesapeake Bay, so by all means.
We already have a book, so that doesn't count.
Do you think that the fishermen of Chesapeake Bay will become part of the solution, or will they simply be overrun by the problem?
No, I think they have to be part of the solution because they know more about many aspects of the bay than any scientists do. And that's why I put in that one slide, stakeholders. You've got to have fishermen, you've got to have farmers, because the farmers in Pennsylvania particularly are going to be asked to give up more than many people. So you have to have the stakeholders involved in these decisions. And their whole way of life, the baymen, the watermen in Chesapeake Bay, you know, that's a way of life. And when the oysters go away or the fish go away, they lose their livelihoods. So yes, they must be involved. And I find when you get them in a group, they have good contributions to make. When you get them in front of a crowd of people, then they role play, and it's so everybody else's fault but theirs. But not in these groups.
Jerry, Francis, I'm up here. Yeah.
Francis, good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to be seen. I'm just in awe and just so grateful that you've written this book. It's going to help in so many ways. My question is two things with climate change. There's no mention one of the greatest polluters has to do with the airlines. And they talk about reducing, the number of cars. And I'm looking at the path of the Chesapeake Bay and the cities that are there. And there's so many major airports there. So do you think if they do something about reducing the emissions from the airlines, that might help a bit? And also, Israel has developed where they can take the water out of the air and in a machine and produce about 130,000 gallons of water. Is doing something like that going to maybe help with this catastrophic situation? Thank you.
Well, let's see. First of all, I think climate change is a global problem. Short term, you can have some effects locally, regionally, but the atmosphere is a global commons. It has a mixing time of about a year, and so when whoever puts CO2 into the atmosphere, whether it's the U.S. or China, it gets mixed, and we're all in the same boat. And so we not only have to reduce the emissions of CO2, we also have to remove some of the CO2 that is already in the atmosphere and lock it away. And the Israelis are masters of living without enough water. And that was one of the things that they decided to have a truly great university at the time. They were on the edge of the desert. Desertification was a global and growing problem even back then. And so water and living in the desert, growing crops, et cetera, that became one of their focuses and their leaders in this to this day.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. So I'm curious about how the scenario planning comes about. You said who should be involved in developing the scenarios, but who should initiate it and who should lead it? Is it the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, or is it time for a big shift?
Well, one of the things I point out in the book is that you've got to keep the participation by the people involved in the Chesapeake program, the current program, to a minimum. It's got to be independent. They have to have access to the data and information that came out of the Bay program. But it has to be people who don't have a stake in continuing the present programs that bring an unending supply of money into their research programs. So it needs to be a different, whether it's the state or the state agency, but it's not the Chesapeake Bay program. They would never do it, I think. It has to be independent.
Jerry, in using the RAND approach with these scenarios, how do you then choose which of the paths to move forward in a democracy?
Well,
Who's the winner?
So you don't choose any one path, but you have several paths, no more than 5, that bound the range of probable futures, all trying to get as close to possible to the vision statement. And what you do is you look across all of these and you find a group of strategies that no matter how the future turns out will work to get you closer to your vision. And then you look for disruptive strategies. It's like playing a game, and it's very interesting. People engage with each other, and the RAND, we were going to do these for San Francisco Bay, and we had developed a proposal. Stephen Popper from the RAND Corporation and I and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation were ready to fund it, but they insisted that if they were going to fund it, that I move to San Francisco and give up my job here, and I wasn't prepared to do that. But you can get support to do these. After spending $25 billion in Chesapeake Bay with almost no progress. Now, mind you, the Bay would have been worse if we hadn't spent that $25 million. But the return on investment is small. I have to believe you could get a few $1 million, that's all it would take, to do some scenario planning, to test the idea out, and then scale it up.
Why don't we just accept reality, let nature take its course, move away from the oceans, and visit them, but don't live there. Just accept reality.
Well, That, Alan, you can say that because you live on very high ground. Now, maybe you're smarter than the rest of us. The population of coastal areas happened during a time of stable sea level in California, nationally, and globally. And how much sea level rises will determine how far we have to flee from the coast. If we're back in the Pliocene, 50 to 80 feet increase in sea level, then we all have to move well away. It doesn't have to be that way, though. I'm convinced that we will be able to keep it at much less than that. So some retreat will be necessary. Part of Chesapeake Bay will be gone. Some of the low-lying communities around the bay, Crisfield, Annapolis, and others, they're going to be gone. But the thing we don't do is you have to start planning and figuring out what to do rather than what we like to do in California is make these outrageous statements, the sea level is going to be this much higher, get away from the coast. That's not planning. That's not good government, so I'm not a great fan of that approach that the Coastal Commission takes.
So, Jerry, like they say, you can't control air pollution, that it goes across governmental boundaries. You've got 6 states about the Chesapeake Bay. Is there a compact that could be formed among those 6 states to say that, and given the authority to make decisions, and are those models used in this kind of planning?
Well, there have been 5 or 6 what are called Chesapeake Bay Agreements among the 6 states and the District of Columbia. And the trouble is the obligations, the commitments are not binding. You would have to do something where it had some teeth. In this country, our approach to coastal management is fractured. Different federal agencies control what happens on the land, and different ones control what happens in the water. It's not a very good way to deal with these complex problems. So could you do it? Yes. And should we do it? I think probably the answer is yes. There should be some kind of a compact among the watershed states. But again, the problem is the people who have to give up the most benefit the least from having a, quote, restored Chesapeake Bay. The farmers in Pennsylvania, the people who live in New York, they have to give up the most, and they benefit directly the least.
Great. So,
Jerry, do you mind one more question before you sign off? Hi, thank you. So great presentation. I was curious to know, I would presume that the leading rivers into the estuary probably have some TMDLs that have been established over the past years or prior. How effective have those TMDLs been and water quality measures of the rivers leading to the estuary in improving the health with dissolved oxygen or eutrophication or any of those standards that have been measured since the TMDLs have been listed?
Okay, so just to remind everybody, a TMDL taps total maximum daily load, and it's the total amount of contamination a river can carry down or a watershed can deliver. The TMDLs worked very well in much of the watershed, but they worked very poorly in the Susquehanna, where it was dominated by non-point sources of pollution, particularly agriculture. And they had a midterm checkup, and Pennsylvania was the state that failed most miserably. Many of the states succeeded. Many of them have smaller parts of the watershed, simpler control to control. So as a whole, it didn't work very well because the biggest problem is non-point sources of nutrients that come from agriculture.
right. Thank you very much, Jerry. I have thanks a lot. Please stay here for a second.
Okay.
So I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping here. Tonight and all the first Wednesdays are supported by the Courtyard by the Marriott in Long Beach. I thank them for that. I also want to say that this is what I mean by thought leadership. It's not the details, it's reframing the problem. And that's what you do so well, and I've always done. And I want to advertise a little bit. The next first Wednesday, Jerry, this is your book? This is the book for the next first Wednesday.
Well, some people take longer to explain.
Yeah. So I just want to say, your book, the book for next first Wednesday, and that is Ian Shive, an amazing, I guess he's been here before, but it's a book about the America's wilderness areas, not parks, wilderness refuge. And he may also talk about, if he's a filmmaker, he's got a fascinating project about, as a photographer and filmmaker, what does the world look at like through the eyes of the animals? So he works with neurophysiologists and so forth to ask that question. And now I hope you will go outside in the Pacific Visions Art Gallery, and Jerry will sign your book, which will be a treat. And there's also cocktails. And that's where I'm going to grill you.
All right.
So thank you again for not just for tonight, but for your whole career.
Thank you, Peter.
You know, like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment tried.